For a span of 8 years, any inquiry regarding Ilhan Omar's matrimony was labeled as Islamophobia. Any reporter who posed a question was branded a bigot, and every probe was dismissed as a witch hunt. Furthermore, not a single piece of evidence was ever presented to resolve the issue. Senator John Kennedy recently placed a federal immigration document from the year 1995 on the desk directly in front of her. This paperwork featured 2 names listed on the identical line within the same family unit, a document she had dedicated her entire professional life claiming did not exist. He stated both names aloud. She has remained publicly silent ever since. I must identify the reality of this situation before it unfolds. Ilhan Omar was seated with her posture erect, her chin perfectly level, and her hands placed on the desk at an equal distance from the microphone. It was the physical geometry of an individual who has been captured by cameras from this exact perspective enough times to understand that symmetry projects composure, composure projects innocence, and projecting innocence is highly beneficial when interrogations are imminent. Her headscarf was arranged with absolute precision, leaving absolutely no crease to chance. As she spoke, her voice did not waver. Every word was delivered on the identical frequency and at the identical volume, much like a machine manufacturing uniform components. This proceeding is not about accountability. It centers on a Muslim woman, a black woman, and a refugee who arrived in this nation with absolutely nothing, yet constructed a life that intimidates the individuals seated opposite her. She purposefully did not glance at Kennedy. Instead, she locked eyes with the camera positioned to the left of the platform, the one broadcasting the live feed, because that lens represented the specific audience she aimed to communicate with, whereas Kennedy did not. Whenever they fail to defeat my policies, they target my personal identity, my marriages, my relatives, and my religious beliefs. It is the exact same strategy, Senator. For 8 years, the identical strategy. And I am present today because I have never feared their inquiries. She had just informed a Senate committee that she had addressed every query for the past 8 years. Senator Kennedy possessed a file folder. Contained within was the solitary document she had spent those exact 8 years assuring the public did not exist. John Kennedy was seated with his hands clasped, his spectacles resting near the tip of his nose, and his file securely shut. He had remained completely motionless during her declaration. His hands, his shoulders, and his mouth were entirely still. He possessed the immobility of a wooden fence post in a storm, standing tall, unhurried, and quietly enduring until the severe weather dissipates. Upon her conclusion, he allowed the chamber to absorb her words for 5 full seconds. This is because, in Louisiana, one allows an individual to completely finish before commencing one's own turn. Such courtesy should not be mistaken for sluggishness. It is simply patience. And within a congressional hearing chamber, patience is the ultimate tool that outlasts all other tactics. Representative, he began, his tone so significantly lower in volume than hers that the audio equipment had to strain to pick it up. You stated you have addressed every inquiry for 8 years, and I will accept your word on that. Therefore, I am simply going to pose a few of those inquiries to you one additional time, very rapidly, and you can provide the identical responses you have always provided, allowing us all to head home for dinner. He unsealed the folder. Kennedy, in the year 2009, you lawfully wed a gentleman named Ahmed Noor Saeed Elmi. Is that correct? Omar, affirmative. Kennedy. And in 2002, 7 years prior to that event, you participated in a religious union with a gentleman named Ahmed Hirsi. Omar, affirmative. Kennedy. You remained in that religious union with Hirsi at the time you lawfully wed Elmi? Omar tilted her chin upward slightly. We had mutually separated, Senator. Marriages conclude. Individuals move forward. This is not a complex matter. Her phrasing emerged rapidly, though not with nervous haste, but rather with rehearsed swiftness, the velocity of a statement that had been pre-constructed and retrieved from storage. It is slightly complex, ma'am, because during 2014 and 2015, while you remained legally wed to Elmi, you submitted joint federal tax filings alongside Hirsi, the gentleman you were not legally wed to, Kennedy pointed out. Omar leaned toward her microphone, a movement resembling a person grasping for a handrail on a staircase that has suddenly begun to pitch forward. It was an urgent posture, characteristic of someone desiring to provide the response before the query had fully settled into the atmosphere. I voluntarily amended those tax documents. The Minnesota Campaign Finance Board examined the issue, and I fully collaborated. The term voluntarily was spoken a fraction of a second too quickly. It was delivered in the manner of a word practiced specifically for this exact instance, by a speaker who did not trust the moment to pause for her. Following their discovery of the discrepancy, after they highlighted it to my awareness, affirmative, and I fully collaborated, she added. She utilized the phrase fully collaborated for the second occasion within 2 statements. This reiteration mirrored the behavior of an individual verifying a locked door twice. The secondary check does not physically fortify the mechanism, but it reveals insight into the mental state of the person performing the action. Her hand migrated toward the table's perimeter, not grasping it firmly, but locating it in the same manner one seeks a wall in a darkened room where the illumination has started to fail. Immigration protocols and religious matrimonies generate intricacies that the United States taxation framework was not engineered to handle. I would assume an individual who purports to champion immigrant populations would comprehend that. That declaration was directed at Kennedy, much like an accusing finger pointed at the incorrect suspect in a police lineup, piercing, resolute, and aimed at someone completely unassociated with the alleged offense. Kennedy allowed the statement to land without objection. He neither fought it, nor pivoted, nor issued a retaliatory remark. He simply nodded once, akin to a patron acknowledging a dining bill that reflects the precise, anticipated total. That is reasonable, Representative. Taxation statutes are intricate. I will concede that point. He flipped to the next page in a completely unhurried manner, and that lack of haste served as his true rebuttal. Now, regarding Ahmed Nur Saeed Elmi, the gentleman you legally married in 2009, what is his familial connection to you? He is my former spouse. We legally dissolved the marriage in 2017. Is he your biological sibling? The alteration in her facial expression was minute. It consisted of the tensing of a pair of jaw muscles, the masseter elevating the jawbone by a mere fraction, the specific type of micro-expression captured by a lens but entirely missed by a written transcript. It was the physical preparation a human form makes prior to the brain finalizing the subsequent vocalization. That is a repulsive falsehood, she stated, her vocal pitch elevating by a half measure, reminiscent of a wire straining when additional pressure is applied to the opposite terminal. Perpetuated by prejudiced internet columns and Islamophobic conspiracy advocates who have singled me out since my initial swearing in. I have confronted this matter in public. I have confronted it while sworn under oath, and I refuse to remain seated here and validate. Ma'am, I did not inquire regarding internet columns. Kennedy's vocal tone remained entirely unchanged. It had not ascended, descended, or wavered. It remained securely in its usual state, a low-register Louisiana drawl. I posed a binary affirmative or negative query, and I have responded to it continuously for 8 years. The response is negative. You have responded to it by categorizing the query as a discriminatory offense. That represents a distinct approach from answering it with empirical documentation. Omar's hand departed from the surface of the desk and formed a gesture in the empty space. An exposed palm rotated upward. It was the physical plea of a defendant signaling the gallery when the courtroom facts have skewed against them. It was the motion of an individual who has depleted their physical evidence and is currently pleading with the audience to sense what they are unable to substantiate. I am not obligated, Senator, to expose my family's personal archives, to satiate the inquisitiveness of individuals who have dedicated their lives to ruining me. No representative in this legislature has ever been instructed. No representative in this legislature has ever been charged with wedding their own sibling. Representative, a single word inserted directly into the core of her declaration, functioning exactly like a metal key, gliding into a mechanism, without violence, without theatricality, merely displaying the engineered accuracy of an object resting where it was purposefully created to rest. Omar's exposed palm retracted. The digits folded inward sequentially, resembling a storefront lowering its security grills, and the hand descended back to the desk where it remained motionless. It did not produce another physical gesture for the remainder of their interaction. A female observer in the audience, who had been bobbing her head in subtle, private agreement, the characteristic motion of an individual resonating with a spoken truth, ceased her movement. Her skull paused at the precise tilt of an individual reevaluating a previously accepted conclusion. The Star Tribune, Kennedy proceeded, his vocalization remaining deep, steady, and burdened with the endurance of an individual who had been executing this duty longer than the majority of the room's occupants had drawn breath. Your local publication, not a right-wing internet site, not a conversational broadcast, your local paper probed this very inquiry, and they published in their own physical pages that they could, quote, neither conclusively confirm nor rebut the allegation. He raised his gaze. Your own publication attempted to exonerate you, ma'am. They were unable to do so because you refused to supply them with the necessary paperwork. The Star Tribune is permitted to chronicle whatever they choose. Omar's vocal register had located a modified foundation. It was not her initial foundation, nor the hyper-precise frequency she utilized at the outset, but rather a thinner, more strained sound comparable to how a chord emanates a distinct noise at identical tension when it has supported a heavy load for an extended duration. Reporters who peddle Islamophobic fringe theories do not gain legitimacy simply because they are employed by a traditional media outlet. Therefore, the Star Tribune is Islamophobic? I did not articulate that. Her chin lowered slightly before elevating again, a microscopic physical correction betraying an involuntary wince that her facial features attempted to mask. It is the distinct physical reaction a human exhibits when they process their own statements being repeated back to them and recognize, a moment too late, the logical conclusion of their argument. You articulated that reporters who pose this query are peddling Islamophobia. The Star Tribune posed this exact query, Kennedy noted, his hands remaining clasped and his voice remaining deep. I am merely a rural attorney, ma'am. However, in my jurisdiction, if an individual declares a query to be Islamophobic, and a reporter poses that exact query, subsequently, that reporter is Islamophobic. That is the fundamental operation of logic, or at least it previously was. You are distorting my statements, Senator. The charge was delivered swiftly, excessively swiftly. It possessed the velocity of a phrase deployed before the underlying concept had completely materialized, similar to a fighter launching a strike after their balance has already been compromised. I am reciting them directly back to you, ma'am. That is a distinction. He extracted one additional sheet from the file. In the month of June 2012, subsequent to the delivery of your third offspring, a social media profile identified as the property of Ahmed Elmi published an image. A male individual cradling a freshly born infant, your infant, representative. He recited from the physical copy, his tone neutral and highly specific. The descriptive text did not state my daughter. It did not state my stepdaughter. It did not utilize the infant's given name. The descriptive text stated nieces. He placed the printed copy on the desk and permitted the term to linger in the atmosphere. Nieces. That is the term your spouse utilized to refer to your newborn infant. Internet platform descriptions are not binding legal paperwork, Senator. Omar's hand was in motion once more, but not toward her hydration glass or the desk's boundary. Instead, it moved toward her personal wrist, where her digits located the interior of her forearm and applied pressure, a stabilizing physical mechanism employed by individuals whose autonomic nervous systems have initiated independent management without conscious authorization. Individuals utilize phrases of affection across various societies that do not convert linearly into English. Nieces does not represent a phrase of affection, representative within any society I possess knowledge of. It signifies a genetic familial bond. It translates to the offspring of your sibling. You do not qualify as an authority on Somali heritage, Senator. This declaration was delivered with the specific momentum of a participant deploying their final playing card while recognizing it belongs to the incorrect suit. It was loud enough to project an illusion of certainty, yet brief enough to reveal the utter lack of substance behind it. She had grasped at cultural heritage in the same manner a submerging individual grasps at floating debris, not because the debris ensures survival, but merely because it represents the final object remaining on the surface. Negative, ma'am, I am not. Kennedy provided a single nod characteristic of an individual receiving an anticipated protest and having already prepared the subsequent dismissal. However, the term nieces belongs to the English lexicon. Your spouse typed it using English upon a United States-based internet application utilizing the English dialect, and within the English dialect, it possesses a singular definition, and that definition dictates a brotherly connection. Let us discuss your present spouse, Kennedy declared. He extracted a fresh segment of paperwork from the folder and aligned it squarely in his workspace. This alignment was the physical manifestation of an individual categorizing materials prior to debate. Because, based on his expertise, structural organization constitutes 50% of the victorious argument. Omar's physical stance altered. It was not a physical capitulation or a withdrawal, but rather a structural realignment. It mirrored a combatant shifting their physical mass upon realizing the engagement will outlast their initial stamina reserves. Her shoulders retracted slightly, and her chin, which had remained parallel to the ground initially but had dipped during the niece's dialogue, was forcefully returned to a parallel state. Similar to an individual adjusting a tilted portrait, they are fully aware will inevitably tilt once more. What regarding his person? Your political organization retained his advisory enterprise, the E Street Group, during 2018. From 2018 through 2020, your organization compensated his enterprise with excess of $3 million regarding advisory services. Tim Minette, Tim's enterprise dispenses legitimate, professional advisory functions. The term legitimate was delivered with heavy stress, functioning as an auditory tell the specific way a person accentuates the word when they anticipate someone is preparing to imply the exact opposite. He ranks among the most seasoned political advisors within Washington. The contract was competitive and fully disclosed. Simultaneously, Representative, during those exact months the payments were authorized, you initiated a romantic dynamic with Mr. Minette. My private affairs do not constitute the focus of this inquiry, Senator. Her hand gravitated toward the microphone to tweak its position. The tweak was entirely superfluous. The device had not shifted, and grasping it represented the action of someone whose fingers desperately required a stationary, anchored object to hold. His spouse believed it constituted the focus. Dr. Beth Jordan Minette initiated divorce proceedings during August of 2019. Furthermore, within her legal documentation, while sworn under oath, she declared that her spouse informed her he was departing their marriage in favor of you, Representative. That does not represent hearsay. That represents a legally binding sworn declaration within a judicial setting. I refuse to provide remarks regarding another individual's marital dissolution proceedings. I comprehend your position, ma'am, and I shall not pressure you regarding the private matters. However, the financial aspect constitutes public documentation, and the financial aspect falls under my purview. Kennedy extracted 3 sheets from his compiled documents. He positioned each upon the desk with the meticulous precision of an individual arranging plates for a highly tense meal. First one, subsequently a second, and finally a third, each assigned a specific location, each bearing significant gravity. He made physical contact with each sheet as he verbalized his points. Document 1, Union Number 1, Ahmed Hersi. A religious union lacking formal legal documentation, signifying you possessed the legal capability to wed a secondary gentleman without legally dissolving the initial union. Fiscal advantage. Mutual federal taxation documents submitted alongside a gentleman you were not legally wed to, while concurrently legally wed to a separate individual. That does not represent an intricacy of immigrant matrimony, Representative. That represents taxation, deception, and the jurisdiction of Minnesota verified it. Document 2, he tapped the second sheet. Union Number 2, Ahmed Elmi. A formal legal marriage to a gentleman your own local publication is unable to verify is not your biological sibling. Fiscal advantage. Immigration standing. Whether said standing was secured via deceptive means is, as of this current morning, subject to federal examination. Document 3, he tapped the third sheet. Union Number 3, Tim Minette, a formal legal marriage to the proprietor of an advisory enterprise your political organization had previously compensated to the tune of $3 million. The financial transfers commenced while he remained legally wed to a separate individual. The financial transfers proceeded subsequent to your marriage to him, and the financial transfers did not diminish. Tap. 3 unions, representative, 3 distinct gentlemen. Every individual, one featuring a fiscal transfer weaving through the connection, like electrical conduit concealed in a partition, that constitutes an offensive. Omar's vocal pitch ascended. This escalation mirrored the instability of an individual standing upon a ladder that is slowly tipping backward away from its supporting structure. The higher her pitch traveled, the more precarious her foundation became. The entire chamber could perceive the fragility in her tone, particularly within the vowels that stretched increasingly thin with every spoken syllable. An offensive misrepresentation of 3 genuine connections that entailed genuine human individuals and genuine emotional states. And I refuse to permit this panel to diminish. Ma'am, misrepresentations do not possess monetary values. Kennedy's vocal pitch remained steadfast. Escalation was unnecessary. It resided exactly where it always resided, securely in the lower register. It was the tone of an individual who had dedicated 4 decades to absorbing the shouts of louder individuals within constrained judicial spaces, ultimately learning that the softly spoken advocate is the one the adjudicators recall when deliberations begin. Federal Election Commission records do possess monetary values, and your records illustrate $3 million transferring from your political repository toward the enterprise possessed by the gentleman you were intimately entangled with. That does not represent a misrepresentation, representative. That represents a ledger entry, and ledger entries lack emotional states. They solely possess digits. Omar parted her lips to issue a retort. Her jaw musculature tensed, her shoulders aligned perpendicularly, and her physical form constructed the architecture necessary for a rebuttal, yet the rebuttal failed to materialize. Her lips sealed, her shoulders relaxed backward. For a microscopic fragment of time, the observing chamber witnessed the expression of an individual who has desperately reached for a defensive tool only to discover an empty scabbard. Kennedy clasped his hands together. 3 unions, 3 fiscal pathways. From my place of origin, representative, we label that a commercial strategy. Kennedy reached beneath his file and extracted one ultimate sheet of paper. He grasped it using both of his hands, the initial instance he had done so during the entire morning session, and the chamber immediately perceived the atmospheric shift, similar to a medical environment reacting when a physician grasps a patient's chart with 2 hands rather than a single hand. Mrs. Omar, for a span of 8 years, you have informed this nation that absolutely no paperwork exists linking yourself and Ahmed Elmi as participants within the identical genetic family unit because you claimed no such paperwork existed. Her vocal tone became entirely monotone. It was no longer piercing, no longer escalating. It was purely flat. The monotonous resonance of an individual who has exhausted their entire strategic playbook and arrived at the final remaining key on the instrument. This panel has secured, via a federal archival legal demand, an immigration request submitted during 1995 to the United States Immigration and Naturalization Service. Document 130, Petition for Alien Relative, submitted on behalf of your familial group to achieve family reunification. Omar's hands flattened completely against the surface of the desk, her digits separated. This expansion was an autonomic physical reaction, not a conscious mental choice. It was the involuntary physical preparation of an individual who remains ignorant of the exact incoming blow, but whose musculature has preemptively opted to brace for the impact. Kennedy recited the listed identities. He dictated them at the deliberate pace of a transcriptionist. Every identity constituted an isolated audio event. Every audio event was allocated its distinct temporal space within the chamber. The requesting party, the reliant party, the familial unit members, and when he reached a specific pair, he paused. The silence of his pause proved more deafening than any vocabulary he had previously uttered that morning. Ilhan Omar, He peered upwards, looking over the upper edges of his spectacles, and his gaze locked onto hers. For the absolute first occasion that morning, she refused to divert her eyes, and Ahmed Noor Said Elmi, he positioned the document onto the desk. The parchment generated a faint acoustic rustle. Upon contacting the timber surface, it was the subtle noise of an entity finally reaching its destination after remaining in continuous transit for 3 decades. Identical request, identical petition, identical residence, identical familial unit, connection to the requesting party for both identities, located on the identical line within the identical designated square, siblings. A writing instrument slipped from the grasp of a reporter seated in the media section. No individual moved to retrieve it. The overhead fluorescent illumination within the chamber vibrated at a pitch that had been present the entire morning, yet had remained completely imperceptible until this exact second. For 8 years, Mrs. Omar, you have informed this nation that this specific paperwork did not exist. I have never laid eyes upon that paperwork. Her vocal register had shifted once more. It was now deeper, swifter, mimicking the frequency of an individual who has ceased delivering a prepared oration and is currently scrambling to address a query she was entirely unprepared to field. I challenge its validity. I was 12 years of age when it was submitted. By your biological father, ma'am. Legally demanded from a federal archival storage facility, verified by the Immigration and Naturalization Service. Kennedy's tone was subdued, and it dictates utilizing dark ink on an official state document that yourself and Ahmed Elmi are biological sister and brother. That paperwork, assuming it is valid, that paperwork does not. Her phrases began materializing devoid of conclusions, each separate thought launching onto a fresh trajectory but inevitably colliding with the identical barrier, mirroring an avian creature striking the same pane of glass from varying trajectories. Every collision generated the identical acoustic response and the identical inevitable failure. Her hand departed the desk surface and formed a gesture significantly more diminished than her previous attempts. The digits curled inward, the appendage withdrawing from the open space as though the atmosphere had transformed into a substance incapable of supporting its mass. The variables surrounding refugee relocation are profoundly intricate, and familial classifications utilized on immigration documentation originating 3 decades in the past do not invariably indicate she halted. She had been constructing a statement designed to rationalize why the paperwork indicated siblings without simultaneously confessing to its factual accuracy. The entire chamber could perceive the exact microsecond she mentally previewed her own defense nearing its logical endpoint and comprehended its inevitable destination, conceding that the paperwork stated one fact, while reality presented a contradiction, signifying either the official documentation was fraudulent or her 8-year campaign of denial was fraudulent. Both pathways terminated in the identical chamber. Ma'am, Kennedy's tone was remarkably subdued. This subdued nature lacked any trace of softness. Rather, it represented the quiet efficiency of a mechanical device finalizing its program sequence. Are you declaring the paperwork is incorrect? That you and Elmi do not share a sibling bond? I am declaring that the variables, because if you are declaring the paperwork is incorrect, you are simultaneously declaring your biological father falsified information upon a federal immigration document submitted under the threat of perjury, and that action, Representative, constitutes a federal offense. The chamber froze completely. The term offense lingered suspended in the atmosphere, resembling a heavy boulder resting at the base of a deep shaft, dense, unyielding, and entirely stationary. Omar parted her lips. The genesis of a phonetic sound materialized the initial millimeter of a vocalization that could have potentially been an excuse or a deflection. Or perhaps it was the specific term she had deployed thousands of times previously. The term initiating with I and concluding with phobia, the very term that had successfully sealed every gateway she had ever required sealing. And subsequently, her lips clamped shut. The term remained trapped internally. It remained trapped because the physical document rested squarely upon the desk. Document 130, dark ink, official state insignia. Her identity and Elmi's identity occupying the identical line within the identical familial unit on a document submitted by her own biological father, she recognized, possessing the stark lucidity of a female who has endured an 8-year span by selecting the precisely optimal phrasing at the precisely optimal second that her chosen term would collide with the physical document and shatter. She understood that labeling the physical paperwork as Islamophobic would absolutely fail to erase the two identities permanently inscribed on the identical line. She realized that physical documents are incredibly patient entities. They reside within metal storage enclosures for decades, remaining utterly indifferent to the labels applied to them by humans, and they fundamentally refuse to vanish. Her left arm elevated from the desk's surface at a glacial pace, as if the limb were passing through a medium significantly denser than oxygen. 2 digits gently settled against her inferior lip, neither masking her oral cavity nor obscuring it, but simply applying minor physical resistance against her flesh, restraining an entity trapped behind her dental ridge that desperately desired release, but was strictly forbidden from emerging. The female observer in the audience, the individual who had previously bobbed her head during Omar's initial identity-focused monologue, who had adjusted her posture to sit more rigidly when Omar referenced intimidating the room's occupants, who had essentially served as Omar's target demographic for the initial quarter hour of the proceeding, was no longer gazing at Omar. She was staring intensely at the physical documentation, at the I-130, at the dual identities, sharing the identical line. She observed the parchment in the specific manner an individual evaluates empirical evidence. That transfer of her visual focus from the human subject to the physical parchment served as a definitive judgment that necessitated no formal declaration from a committee chairperson. I possess 0 additional remarks to provide at this current moment. 10 words, the most frigid declaration she had ever uttered. Devoid of the term repulsive, devoid of the term prejudiced, devoid of fiery rhetoric, it was purely an attorney's mandated phrasing, the exact sequence of words legal representation instructed her to deploy if the entire structure collapsed. It was the auditory manifestation of a political figure instantly transforming into a legal subject broadcast live on television before a populace that had been posing the identical query for 8 continuous years, and had, for the absolute first occasion, secured a response that was neither an evasion nor a countercharge, nor a vocabulary word concluding in phobia, but rather an official state document featuring 2 identities occupying the identical line. Kennedy rose to his feet. He traversed the perimeter of the desk at a sluggish pace, mirroring a property owner, inspecting a boundary line he had memorized since childhood, mentally tallying wooden markers using his digits. Every marker represented a border. Every border represented an empirical reality. 2002A religious union to Ahmed Hirsi. Lacking formal legal documentation, 2009A formal legal marriage to Ahmed Elmi, while maintaining a religious union with the initial gentleman. 2014, 2015 mutual federal taxation documents submitted alongside the initial gentleman while concurrently legally wed to the secondary gentleman. 2017 marital dissolution from Elmi, 8 years subsequent to the nuptials, 2 years subsequent to the discovery of the taxation deception. 2018 formal legal marriage to Hirsi, finally 2019 marital dissolution from Hirsi, owing to the introduction of a tertiary gentleman. 2020 matrimony to Tim Mynett. $3 million originating from political campaign repositories previously funneled into his enterprise. He reached the final document, the I-130. He maintained his digit against it for a duration exceeding the previous taps, a duration sufficient for the broadcasting lenses to lock onto the specific motion, a duration sufficient for a male observer situated in the audience to tilt forward in an attempt to decipher the contents of the parchment. 1995. A federal immigration document, your identity. Elmi's identity. Identical line, identical family, siblings. He pivoted. He gazed at her across the expansive desk and the bleached divide of paperwork separating them. 8 documents, 8 chronological stamps, 8 exchanges, a trail of paper spanning from his perimeter of the desk to her perimeter, resembling an asphalt pathway terminating at a destination neither individual could feign ignorance of any longer. 8 chronological stamps, 3 spouses, 3 fiscal pathways. Furthermore, not a single one of these connections, not one solitary instance, Mrs. Omar, functions absent an associated fiscal exchange. Immigration advantages, taxation deception, $3 million in political campaign, capital funneling directly into the enterprise of the gentleman you were engaging in intimate relations with. He removed his spectacles, collapsing them with the intentional precision of an individual sealing a novel they have concluded reading, and placed them onto the desk adjacent to the I-130. The metallic snap of the joints echoed through the silence, similar to a locking mechanism echoing when a portal seals permanently. You labeled it Islamophobia, Mrs. Omar. For a span of 8 years, every inquiry constituted Islamophobia. Every reporter inquiring constituted a bigot. Every probe constituted a witch hunt. And for 8 years, this fragment of parchment, he made physical contact with it. One ultimate time was residing inside a metal storage unit, inside a state archival facility within a metallic compartment. No individual extracted it, accumulating particulate matter in absolute darkness. He resumed his seat, clasped his hands together, and uttered 2 terms that possessed a lower volume than every preceding statement, yet echoed significantly louder. Somebody inquired, epilogue, the aftermath. The video segment achieved 55 million views within a 2-hour window. The public dubbed it the documents and the abbreviated variation of 4-0 second span, featuring Kennedy reciting the I-130 details. Identical request, identical family, siblings, followed by Omar's digits, applying pressure to her inferior lip, and the subsequent 10-word declaration disseminated in a manner vastly divergent from previous segments. The reason being that the quietness contained within it did not represent the quietness of an individual who had been defeated in a debate. It represented the quietness of an individual who had been exposed. The Department of Justice declared it was assessing the immigration request collaboratively alongside the Department of Homeland Security. The House Ethics Committee launched an official probe scrutinizing Omar's taxation records and the $3 million in political campaign expenditures directed to the E Street Group. Nancy Mace, an individual who had previously attempted to legally demand Omar's paperwork in January, only to face obstruction, published a singular phrase. Somebody yanked the compartment open. 3 Democratic members representing the Minnesota delegation issued public declarations within a 48-hour time frame. None explicitly referenced Omar using her given name, yet every single one deployed the term accountability. That precise evening, a gentleman named Amir was seated inside a solitary bedroom residence located in Falls Church, Virginia, viewing the extended 14-minute variation upon his portable computer. Amir had immigrated to the United States from Iran 11 years prior. He had endured a 7-year wait to secure his permanent residency documentation, 7 years consisting of paperwork, monetary charges, biometric appointments, and interrogations, wherein officials posed the identical inquiries utilizing 3 distinct variations to verify the consistency of his responses. 7 years of manually completing I-130S and I-485S at a dining surface, keeping a translation manual accessible because the English language was his secondary tongue, and immigration paperwork barely resembles conventional English. He had submitted every required charge, and those charges were substantial, and they became payable regardless of his financial liquidity at the time. He had executed every step correctly in the proper sequence at the designated moment because that constituted the fundamental agreement. Adhere to the regulations, endure your designated wait time, provide factual information on every document, and the nation permits your entry through the primary gateway as a legitimate individual. He observed Omar upon the monitor. He observed Kennedy reciting the I-130 featuring the dual identities occupying the identical line. He observed her digits coming to rest against her lip. He did not experience rage. Instead, he experienced the profound skeletal exhaustion of an individual who had queued for 7 years, who had completed every necessary document, who had provided factual responses every single time a query was posed, and who was currently observing an individual who had purportedly circumvented the entirety of the framework, subsequently dedicating 8 years to branding anyone who pointed out the discrepancy as prejudiced. He sealed his portable computer. He remained seated within the silence of his residence, absorbing the auditory drone of vehicular movement along Route 7. This specific silence required no supplementary noise because certain realities do not necessitate verbal analysis. They simply require an individual to yank open the storage compartment. Upon a veranda situated in Madisonville, Louisiana, John Kennedy sat accompanied by iced tea that had lost its chill, surrounded by nocturnal insects, generating a volume exceeding what his television had produced. He had abstained from contacting anyone via telephone. He harbored no intentions of contacting anyone via telephone. His thoughts were fixated on a metal storage unit, a metallic compartment located within a state archival facility at an undisclosed location, rows of identical units resting beneath fluorescent illumination, containing paperwork originating from 3 decades prior, residing within folders that no human had made physical contact with since the exact date of their initial submission. 8 years, he remarked to the nocturnal insects, or perhaps to the blackness, or perhaps to the muggy Louisiana evening that encompassed them equally. That parchment was residing inside a unit for 8 continuous years, and 0 individuals yanked the compartment open. He consumed a portion of his beverage, which possessed 0 remaining chill, and placed the vessel upon the armrest of his seating furniture. Occasionally, the solution isn't actively concealing itself, Becky. It is merely resting in a location nobody considered investigating, primarily because the individual to whom it pertained was screaming forcefully enough to repel everyone away from the storage unit. Within a residence situated in Washington, Ilhan Omar was seated opposite her legal representative across a dining surface. They were not communicating via telephone. They were physically present, sharing the identical surface, positioned near enough to perceive the auditory friction of his writing instrument dragging across the legal notepad, yet distanced enough to prevent her from deciphering his notations. That friction constituted the most prominent noise within the space. She was abstaining from speaking. She was abstaining from evading. She was abstaining from branding anyone a bigot, or citing the privileges of displaced persons, or deploying the specific vocabulary word that had shielded her for 8 years but had comprehensively failed her during the current day. She was contemplating Mogadishu. She was contemplating the encampment situated in Kenya, Dadaab, the pervasive particulate matter that infiltrated all spaces, the auditory drone of electrical generators during the night, the endless delays. She contemplated the aircraft journey to America and the initial residence in Minneapolis. She remembered her initial winter season, witnessing frozen precipitation contacting flesh that had never previously experienced freezing temperatures. And this freezing temperature was not merely atmospheric. It represented the frigid nature of a nation that necessitated written verification for absolutely everything, that cataloged absolutely everything, that preserved absolutely everything within storage units inside massive facilities eternally. She had originated from an environment where paperwork incinerated, where archives evaporated, and where historical events could be abandoned because history itself was composed of transient dust. She had relocated to an environment where paperwork endured, where archives resided inside metallic compartments beneath fluorescent illumination, and where historical events failed to evaporate, simply because an individual traversed an oceanic expanse. She pondered, while seated within her dining space alongside her legal representative, accompanied by the friction of his writing instrument and the deafening silence of a professional trajectory that had completely exhausted its vocabulary, whether the pathway stretching from Dadaab to the United States Congress concluded in this exact location. This specific space, this specific surface, this specific legal notepad, and a singular fragment of parchment originating in 1995. A fragment she had genuinely, profoundly trusted, possessing the conviction of an individual who had endured solely by advancing and eternally refusing to glance backward, had completely evaporated alongside her former existence. The former existence absolutely refuses to evaporate. It resides within a metal storage unit inside an archival facility, submerged in darkness, remaining patient, remaining silent, eternally waiting until an individual ultimately yanks open the compartment. 3 unions, 3 fiscal pathways, a single immigration document originating in 1995 featuring dual identities occupying the identical line. She labeled the inquiries as Islamophobia for an 8-year span. The physical paperwork was present the entire duration.